Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. We acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal owners of the land upon which we are meeting. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders, past, present, and future, and elders from other communities who may be here today. The last time we were able to hold the national conference was in October 2019, and it is somewhat of an understatement to say that a lot has happened since then. All of our lives have been significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions it placed on us and on the institutions in which we work or have worked. The good news is that those restrictions hopefully are behind us. They're being eased and could well be a thing of the past. I say hopefully for many reasons, but not the least being that we have been able to hold a virtual conference this year and are planning an in-person one for next year. The national conference is a very important part of the health of the ASPG. It is the forum where members of the group come together to exchange ideas, to learn from each other, and to strengthen relationships with like-minded colleagues who care very deeply about the central role parliaments play in liberal democratic political systems. On behalf of all ASPG members, I thank most sincerely the Victorian Parliament for hosting the conference and for the strong support it has given to the Victorian chapter, in particular its executive team. Without that strong support, it would not have been possible to hold this four-day event. I'm very grateful for the support of all conference attendees, those presenting papers, and those who have agreed to chair various meetings. I know that over the next 4 days, you're going to learn a lot about Parliament and the checks and balances needed to ensure they continue to function always in the public interest. I hope you enjoyed the 2022 conference. I have been attending national conferences for many years now, and I can honestly say I have never been to one where I didn't improve my knowledge of Parliament and related issues, nor have I attended one that I didn't thoroughly enjoy, and I'm confident that this year's will be no exception. I encourage you all to please attend the AGM tomorrow afternoon, as we do need a quorum, and I do ask you to please try and be there at the end of the conference as well. There's nothing more disheartening than having spent days preparing a paper to find that everybody's gone home because it's near the end of the conference. I closed by once again thanking the Victorian Parliament and the Victorian Chapter Executive for the really hard work required of them to make the next 4 days a reality. I acknowledge the exceptional efforts of former Secretary of the Victorian Chapter, Anique Owen, and the current Secretary, Rachel Pineda-Lyon. I'm now going to hand over to the Honourable Nazih Elasmar, President of the Victorian Parliament, who will be officially declaring the conference open. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can now.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that. Sorry we had a problem. Thanks, Colleen, and good morning to everyone. I also like to acknowledge the owners of the land and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. I am delighted to be with you for the official opening of the ASPG conference for 2022. At a time of heightened uncertainty and tensions, it is timely to come together in a forum of open and robust dialogue to discuss some of the important issues facing our parliaments. We need moments of reflection such as this to study how our parliamentary systems are working and how they can be improved. I hope your conversations this week will shine new light on some of the fundamental principles upon which our parliamentary systems are founded and on which they could flounder without adequate care and attention. I urge you to challenge each other throughout this conference, to check how our parliaments are traveling to balance the interests of all who participate in our parliamentary processes, and to be transparent in how we can confront the challenges democracy is currently facing. The study parliament is no easy task, as it is a complex creation. Program ahead of you indicates that many layers that need to be peeled back, and many dimensions that need to be explored if we are to adequately understand what is happening in and with parliaments in the 21st century. The list of presenters and participants in this conference gives me confidence that you will advance the debate on what our parliaments need to do to enhance public trust in them. After all, the checks, balances, and transparency of parliaments are ultimately directed at ensuring that our institution operate in the public interest. Public confidence in democracy should underpin your discussions at this conference, because without it, we face more uncertainty and tensions. The fog of COVID-19 has been affecting many of our parliamentary operations over the past 2 years, but it has also made us think of new ways to work and connect with each other. In particular, it has challenged us to consider how effective our checks and balances are when faced with an unprecedented crisis. As the fog begins to lift, we must seize the opportunity to move forward with the lessons we have learned. I hope you will spend some valuable time this week looking into what the new normal will be for parliaments. I congratulate the conference organizers for the comprehensive program you have developed, and I thank the many people who are stepping forward to share your views and insights on the topics being discussed. In uncertain times, it is also vital to recognize and celebrate the many good things that Parliament are doing. I urge you to do that in your presentation and discussions so that we build on what we have and make it better along the way. To study Parliament is no easy task, but it is an important duty for those who believe that Parliament must respond to the times we live in to be both representative and effective. I wish you well in your deliberations, but most importantly, I wish that you have a healthy and vigorous debate. To study Parliament is no easy task, but I am sure that you are up to the challenge. As the President of the Legislative Council, and on behalf of the Australian Study of Parliament Group, I now officially open the 2022 conference, and good luck.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and for those wise words. It's really important, our parliaments, and we have to do everything we can to ensure they are protected.
Pleasure.
There are now a couple of housekeeping matters that I need to run through. Please, can you have your microphones muted at all times unless you are speaking? Cameras are to remain off unless you are presenting. And could you please save all questions until the end of each session and use the raise hand information function down the bottom of your screen. It now gives me much pleasure to be introducing the keynote speaker, Dr. Margaret Simons, who is the Honorary Principal Fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism. I have been following Margaret's work for way back into even the Fitzgerald days, and I have always been so impressed with the quality and balance of everything she writes. For me, she is the epitome of professional journalism and what is meant by the role of the fourth estate. But there are a few other things that I would like to tell you about Margaret. She describes herself as a journalist, writer, and academic, roughly in that order. She is a multi-award winner for her journalism, and Margaret has co-authored the political memoirs of former Prime Minister, the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, and I've read the book, I can recommend it, and has also written books on the Canberra Press Gallery and religion in politics, as well as writing extensively on the media. From 2012 to 2017, Margaret was director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism and the coordinator of the innovative Master of Journalism degree at the University of Melbourne. I know some people who did that degree, and they speak so highly of the quality of that master's program. Before joining the University of Melbourne, Margaret was a convener of journalism at the Swinburne University of Technology. Until the end of 2019, Margaret was an associate professor at the School of Media, Film and Journalism at Monash University. As of 2021, Margaret is an honorary fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. She also has written an article on the independents that are running in the forthcoming election, which is in this edition of the monthly. And I highly recommend it for anybody who wants a balanced approach to that whole issue. I will now hand over to Margaret to deliver her keynote. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, and also for the invitation. It's always a privilege to speak to conferences of this sort. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their elders, past, present and emerging, indeed of all the lands on which this conference is taking place, including where I live here in Melbourne. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm assuming that's a yes. The theme of your conference is parliamentary transparency, checks and balances, and I've been asked to speak about the role of the media, which is of course traditionally, ever since the days that the term fourth estate emerged during the French Revolution, part of democracy because of its role, ideally, in contributing to transparency, keeping a check on government, and making sure that people are sufficiently informed to cast a sensible vote, particularly important at the moment, of course, as we're in the middle of a federal election campaign. Now, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people feel that this isn't working ideally at the moment. Having been a journalist for 40 years, I think I can probably say it's never worked ideally, but there are some particular things, pathologies, if you like, or weaknesses in the way this function is being performed presently. And I'd like to talk about those today. I'm planning to talk for about 30 minutes, and then if the conference format allows for it, we'll be very happy to take questions after that. I was reflecting today as I read the Australian newspaper and its reporting of the latest news poll results, which show, for those of you who haven't caught up with it, that the two-party preferred vote, according to Newspoll, has not shifted at all over the 2 weeks of the campaign. And of course, the temptation is to see that as evidence that despite all of the events in the campaign, the media events, actually nothing has happened. Of course, Newspoll doesn't tell us whether this is because people aren't paying attention or because they made their mind up ages ago and are not planning to change their mind, or some other factor. And yet the news poll, of course, is...
Excuse me, Margaret, could you just speak up a little? I've just had a text sent asking to put your microphone up a bit, please.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll just move closer to it.
Thank you.
And please let me know if that doesn't fix the problem, but I will speak up as well a bit. So despite all that's happened, a number of media events, from Albanese's gaffe on unemployment figures to the debate hosted on Sky News, and sometimes, of course, the incursion of real events such as the Solomons signing its agreement with China, we haven't seen any shift in public opinion polls. But of course, the poll is itself a media event commissioned by the media and front page news because it is an easy exclusive. So there are a few things I want to say today to try and put this into a larger context by talking about how media has changed and what that means for us as a society, including but much broader than the current election campaign. It's about the way we discuss issues of current concern and the media's role in this, which is no longer, of course, as unchallenged and exclusive as it used to be. I think for at least 25 years now, almost, well, more than half of my career, it's been true to say that no industry is changing faster than media, and no profession is changing faster than journalism. It's been true for 25 years, it remains true today. And self-evidently, that has import for democracy and also importance for our ability to cohere as a society. So I want to examine some of these issues under 4 headings: business model, new players, speed and convergence, and then try and draw a few conclusions and perhaps point some ways forward. I think a lot of people don't appreciate the impact of the collapse of the business model, which for most of my lifetime has supported most serious journalism. The collapse of the business model has come in 2 stages. And the first stage was the loss of classified advertising, which used to support newspapers such as The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, the loss of the classified advertising to online platforms. At about the same time, we lost what you might call, or began to lose, what you might call appointment viewing. The idea that the audience at 6 or 7 o'clock each evening would gather around the television to watch the evening news. That no longer happens really, for all except a very small section of the population, a rapidly aging part of the population. As anybody with children will know, everybody's in their own room or on their own screens, or sometimes on multiple screens at once. And the idea of having a media event that everybody gathered around has changed. Because the audience wasn't concentrated in those moments, you weren't able to charge as much for a television advertisement. Adverts screened during the evening news used to attract an absolute premium because most of the population were watching. That's no longer the case. Television advertising these days is very cheap. And of course, the reduction in classifieds was absolutely devastating for the big newsrooms, which were basically our serious broadsheet newspaper newsrooms. Just to give you an idea, adjusted for inflation, in 2001, classified advertising revenue was $3.7 billion in Australia. And by 2016, it was just 225 million. Now that is a massive and very rapid decline. Hard to think of any other industry, certainly one as important as media and journalism, that has suffered that sort of decline so quickly. Now, this was the story of the 1990s, and it was a traumatic time. I remember it well. There were repeated waves of redundancies. Many outlets closed altogether. The Bulletin magazine, for example, some may remember, used to be a very important journalistic outlet, no longer with us. We lost most of our evening newspapers, all over a process of about 2 years. Other outlets, such as the Times on Sunday. And on the remaining outlet, journalistic staff was cut in successive waves of redundancies, which had a devastating impact, both just on the ability to cover the news of the day, but also, I would say, on culture, on training, on journalists' confidence in their sense of mission and their role in democracy. There were rolling waves of changes right through the 90s and into the new century. Now, newsrooms were still adjusting to that imperfectly, in my view, when the next wave of disruption, which is still with us, began, and that was the rise of the so-called digital platforms, social media and search engines. Chief amongst them, of course, Google, Facebook, increasingly YouTube, and that took most of the rest of the advertising revenue. So a huge quantity, I think it's 80% of advertising revenue these days across the Western world, is captured by the digital platforms. But as well as that, and at the same time as that, social media, it's now clear, began to make inroads into the media's accustomed and hitherto largely unchallenged place at the centre of public debate, as the curator and the feeder of public debate. So how did the industry adjust to these multiple waves? Well, I think any industry faced with such change would have struggled, even if it was superbly managed, but media wasn't always superbly managed. And there was a great deal of experimentation and many false steps. Just a relatively small point is that one of the first part of the journalistic staff to get sacked or made redundant were the sub-editors, which, for those who don't work in journalism, are the people who do the fact-checking, the checking on spelling and grammar, and write the headlines and the photo captions. And I think we can all nominate errors in this morning's newspapers even, which reflect the fact that the sub-editors are barely there anymore. But there were other significant kinds of experimentation. One of them was clickbait. You're probably all familiar with clickbait. The idea of feeding you, largely through social media, a headline or an arresting image, which could be misleading, but had the purpose of encouraging you to click on it so that you would go through to the media website. Everybody tried this game. It's still with us, of course. If you access a free-to-air outlet, such as the Daily Mail online, for example, you'll certainly encounter clickbait. But for serious journalism, it actually didn't work. Because once the advertising isn't there, the purpose of getting the audience member to arrive on your website is rather defeated. You're not actually earning very many dollars from that. Another area of experimentation, which is still with us, as I say, the industry is still working out how to deal with these changes, was highly opinionated journalism. Social media, of course, was full of opinion, remains the case today. And the idea was that people no longer wanted the objective, impartial voice of journalism, and indeed that in some ways that could be something of a con, that it could actually obscure all kinds of bias under that sort of faux, both sides objective voice. And so increasingly journalists began to think that it was their role to give you opinion with the news, interwoven in the news, whereas I'm still a bit old school, I was trained that those two things should always be separated. But again, I have to say that the current evidence and the current thinking in serious journalistic outlets is that that too doesn't work. It's not that people don't read opinion, it's not that people don't click on clickbait, but they won't pay for it. And because the advertising has disappeared to such an extent, the emphasis now in serious journalistic outlets is persuading people to pay subscriptions. So the content is now behind paywalls, and with various differences to different outlets, you basically have to pay to read the content on a consistent basis. So for most of my career, the convention was that advertising earned about 80% of the revenue of media outlets, and 20% came from the people who went down to the corner and actually bought the physical newspaper. That has changed. Revenue at places like the Australian, the Age, the Sydney Morning Herald comes from about 50% from subscriptions and 50% from advertising. Now that is a huge shift of power from the advertisers to the audience for journalism. But I think neither the audience nor the media companies have fully got to grips yet with what that might mean in the long run. And of course, the audience is generally not organised in bringing its views to bear. But nevertheless, there is huge potential in that, I think. However, those are the percentages of the revenue. The reality is there is much less revenue than there used to be. Also, and this is extremely significant, only a very small part of the audience is paying, of the potential audience is paying. One of the best sources of data on how people use media is from the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra, which does an annual survey of about 7,000 Australian users, part of a much bigger international effort run out of the Voices Institute at Oxford University. That survey shows that only 13% of Australians are paying for a news service. That's 13%. And that is considerably lower than the global average, which is 17%. Now, of course, we have the ABC, which is free to air. And I think that that is enormously important. It may be one of the reasons that we have a low percentage of people paying for content. But it does mean that journalism, including political journalism, including parliamentary reports, that is published behind paywalls is no longer really mass media. It's informing an elite. And to the extent that it trickles through to the majority, it does so by influencing the free-to-air outlets where most Australians get their news. Now, free-to-air outlets includes the ABC, of course, but also commercial television, which is still very important. But increasingly, Australians are getting their news from social media. The University of Canberra research shows that 23% of news media users say that social media is their main source of news, And many others, of course, have social media as an important component of their media diet. Also, they are not necessarily getting this news from the social media accounts of mainstream media and professional journalists. They're getting it from all over, and we don't know enough about from where they're getting it. This is fast increasing, and it's increasing across all age groups. If you think this is only a phenomenon among the young, you're wrong. The fastest growing component, in fact, is Australians over 70. So it's crossing all demographics and growing very fast. So at the same time as that's happened, of course, we have many fewer journalists. Census data shows that in the 10 years from 2006 to 2016, the number of Australian journalists fell by 9% overall and by 26% for traditional print journalists. Data provided by the main media companies to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission showed that the number of journalists in traditional media businesses fell by 20% from 2014 to 2018. And this, I should add, is at a time when Australian population and the economy were both growing strongly. So if the business was in a healthy shape, you would have expected the numbers of journalists to be growing quite strongly as well. Now, this shows up in many different ways. I think one of the most concerning is local journalism. We no longer have local newspapers across great swathes of suburban and regional Australia. Those that have survived are often, in fact, running content that's produced far away in some distant city by a single journalist just churning content. The urban fringe, where the next version of Australia is being constructed, where we have high numbers of migrant communities, multi-language, multi-faith communities, is barely served by journalism at all. And indeed, when journalists arrive on the urban fringe, it is nearly always bad news for that community. Think of the so-called African gangs controversy, for example, which many of those communities are still dealing with the aftermath of that. The ACCC's research has shown that there is less local government and local court reporting, both of which are very important for functioning of the democratic process. And there is really not yet any indication of a business model that can effectively replace the advertising-based model, and which has historically funded the production of those types of journalism. Also declining, according to the ACCC, is serious political analysis, science reporting, health reporting, arts reporting, a whole load of areas which help us as a society to know ourselves and to make decisions about our future. So much for the collapse of the business model. I now want to talk about new entrants in the newsmaking business. It's not all bad news. For the first time in human history, anyone who has an internet connection and a computer can publish to the world. And that has already changed just about everything and continues to change things. And we're going to have to get to grips with that phenomenon, I think, as a society. On the upside, because the cost of printing and distributing newspapers used to be so high, the internet has made it possible for web-only publications to publish, including Australian outlets of international media organisations such as the Daily Mail, which I referred to earlier, The Guardian, BuzzFeed, although it didn't last very long. Before all of them, of course, we had homegrown alternatives such as Crikey, which was one of the first internet-based publications. And of course, we know that very few people these days are actually reading an old-fashioned hard copy newspaper. When I refer to newspapers, most of us, including myself, are reading it online. We also have, of course, digital multi-channels. All of the commercial broadcasters now have multiple channels available, and so do the public broadcasters, such as the ABC. Now, one of the things that has meant is the live news channel, which means that media conferences and parliaments are broadcast live. We saw this very powerfully, I think, in Victoria during the early days of the pandemic, when the Premier, Dan Andrews, did a daily media conference at which he would answer all questions, sometimes on his feet for more than 2 hours, and where the conference became the journalism. The journalists were asking questions, but most of the people who were watching, and they were in their millions, would never read the journalism. All they saw of the journalists were the questions that they asked, and for the most part, they didn't seem to like what they saw once they had this insight into how the journalistic sausage is made. We also have Twitter, of course, as a news feed, which serves as a sort of Greek chorus, if you like, on journalism as journalism is being done. And we also have misinformation, which is surely one of the great evils of our age. So this creates several phenomena. First off, we have a fifth of state, if you like, of engaged citizens networked through social media, critiquing the fourth estate, as well as the politicians. It's not all bad. There's some research that suggests people who access news through social media are actually accessing a wider array of sources than those of us who are still relying on traditional media, either hard copy newspapers or appointment television, or even just the single websites of our preferred news outlets. But of course, there's also the potential, as we've seen in the USA, for people to shun the traditional media altogether and instead prefer their own alternative media outlets, which have completely dropped the idea of any kind of journalistic objectivity and are nakedly partisan. We do have a version of that here in some of the commentators on Sky News After Dark, which has a low audience, but is now free in the regions, raising the possibility, not yet fulfilled, I think, of an even greater rural and urban divide in Australia, which is already, I think, a problem in our politics. So what does all this mean for journalists and their responsibilities? For example, if a politician is telling falsehoods, either in Parliament or on social media or in a media conference, should journalists report them, knowing that their own reports will actually help spread the falsehood? Or should they not report them, or how should they report them? And how does that square with traditional notions of objectivity? I don't have easy answers to this, but I think it's really important. And the ecosystem in which journalism works these days is well illustrated by some recent academic research, which looked at how the idea that COVID is caused by 5G telephone towers, how that idea spread. It started on social media and originally was confined to a very small group on social media. Then a couple of celebrities began to get into it, and the entertainment media, if you like, the sort of soft entry point to mainstream media, reported on the celebrities without perhaps, because it's entertainment media and not taken so seriously, without perhaps the sort of ethical considerations that one hopes might apply to political journalism. Now, the mainstream media, having reported on it, that was then picked up by the social media groups and reused, often without any of the qualifying comments of the mainstream media outlet. And it was actually that act, the mainstream media then being used in the ecosystem of social media, which sent that conspiracy theory global and made it very powerful. An interesting thing that happened then, of course, is that the 5G towers were vandalised in the UK and people were appearing in court. Now, of course, once it hits court, that's the sort of thing which a media outlet would normally report on. And yet again, the mainstream media content and the reporting of that was selectively used by the conspiracy theorists, and it helped to spread that theory to the point where I would hazard a guess that everybody listening to me now probably knows somebody who actually believes this theory, or has heard of somebody who actually believes this theory. And that's the result of this ecosystem effect. You can see the same sort of ecosystem operating in the reporting of the election. For example, TikTok, which is one of the fastest growing social media platforms at the moment. All the political parties have TikTok channels, and as well, politically engaged citizens are putting out TikTok memes, which, for example, remix Albanese's employment figures gaffe with Adam Bant's Google It Mate intervention to music, sometimes with a dance, and make a powerful political point. And in turn, of course, some of those memes sometimes become news stories in their own. And we've seen that, for example, with the candidate running against Zali Steggall in Sydney and her previous social media comments on transgender women. So that becomes the ecosystem throws up those comments and they become a news story in itself. And that is then used and reused by interested parties on social media. So these days, journalists are part of an ecosystem, feeding on and being fed on by others. And we're all still adjusting to that. It's not something which is resolved or finished. That brings me to the third heading, which is speed. And I think this is one of the things that non-journalists perhaps least understand about modern journalism. There are many fewer journalists, and those that are left are working at phenomenal speed. At risk of betraying my age, just to recap my own history, when I was a journalist at The Age, starting in the early 1980s, if you stayed past midnight, not only could you feel the building shake as the printing presses rolled, but you would also see lined up outside the building, taxi drivers and other citizens waiting for the news, literally hot off the press. There was one deadline a day, and the city waited for that paper to appear. What an old-fashioned idea, really, waiting for a certain hour of the day in order to find your news. Now, these days, of course, there is no deadline, or rather there are multiple deadlines through the day. And that means that this ecosystem effect happens at astonishing, mind-bending speed. The gaffe, for example, the employment figures gaffe, within minutes, people were saying, will this dominate the campaign? Albanese was asked by a Sky News journalist, is this the moment you lost the election campaign? Now, with the vast distance of 2 weeks between that event and now, we can obviously say, well, no. As previously mentioned, the polls haven't shifted at all. Apparently, it didn't matter. But journalists right now who are following the campaign buses, well, of course, Albanese doesn't have a bus at the moment because he's sick, but they are having to file many stories a day. And often they're out of touch with everything else that's happening in the country at that moment. You might see, if you tune into the media conferences, that they appear to be reading from their telephones. That is quite often because they're being briefed by the journalists on the other bus following the other leader on what that leader just said, so that they can put questions concerning that. And then by the end of the day, the whole system will have responded to that event all over again. And occasionally you will get an intervention from the outside world. Solomon Islands is the one at the moment, or a news poll, which is taken to be some sort of connection with reality in this fevered world. Coming to my fourth heading, we have convergence, a strange word, but it's really a reference to the fact that there is really, although I've been referring to newspapers, there's really no newspapers anymore. There's even no broadcasters. They all do everything. So the ABC used to be a public broadcaster in the literal sense, is now better known in many ways for its text reports than for its regular television shows. The Age runs video, of course, and is part of the Nine group. The Nine News also has text. So it's all meshed together. Most media organizations also do podcasts, which is a kind of radio. Probably in the next few years, we're going to see the end of terrestrial broadcasting and the rise of streaming, which of course is also, generally speaking, a paid service. And so that again will alter the economy of the media. And if you need evidence of how little the industry has yet to get to grips with this, we still have regulators such as the Australian Press Council, which are only covering print outlets and their websites, and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which is the broadcasting regulator, has no reach at all to traditional newspapers, even though they're carrying broadcasting content. So our whole system of regulation is struggling to keep up. So to sum up, the industry has already been through a trauma, multiple traumas, waves of traumas, and continues to suffer profound challenges which affect political reporting. I'd like to quote here from an interview I did some time ago with Catherine Murphy, who will be familiar to many of you. She's the Canberra-based political commentator for The Guardian in Australia and a journalist of many years' experience previously with Fairfax. She described the changes she's lived through in these words. You're a car factory worker, and overnight your employer says to you, okay, you've been a car assembler for the last 20 years, but we put in overnight all this different equipment, which requires you to do the same task in quite different ways. Oh, and could you also do it in front of a live audience, which is commenting constantly about how you could do it better? And could you produce a car that in essence nobody wants to pay for? That's sort of analogous to what practicing journalists have gone through in the last decade or so. So in that environment, are you going to get it right all the time when you're being asked to report in a wholly different news cycle, a much more fragmented news cycle? You too are learning the increased tempo and operating requirements of your audience. There's fewer of you doing it. Are you going to be perfect? Are you going to land everything perfectly through that transition? Well, no, obviously not. Now, Catherine Murphy is one of the more thoughtful commentators on these changes. Too often, I fear, we're seeing a fair bit of denial about the problems that these changes have brought. So let's think about some ways ahead. Journalism and journalists are, in a very real sense, a byproduct of technological innovation. The whole profession is really a symptom of communications technology. The profession came to be in the sort of 16 and 1700s, and the relevant technological revolution of those times, of course, was the impact of the invention of the printing press in the 1400s. And that really changed everything as well in its own time. It changed power relationships and the spread of knowledge. The Pope was very quickly burning translations of the Bible and burning some of the people who translated it as well. And over time, it led to ideas of the nation state and forms of governance. Because, for example, democracy, which assumes that a bunch of people who don't necessarily know each other and geographically remote, can really only work if you have some means of sharing information. So with the invention of the printing press, it became possible to have large audiences for the same news. And the whole idea of the public and the public interest, and of course, parliamentary democracy, is really only enabled by that technological innovation. Modern capitalism as well, if you think about it, would have been very constrained if it weren't for the ability to share business news. And only really with the spread of information does it make sense to talk about a public life, separate to but touching and touched by our private existences. Only with the spread of information can people have sufficient trust to elect people or to invest and trade across distances. So without the printing press, we wouldn't have the concept of the public, let alone the public interest. Now, I think we're living through at least the equivalent innovation to the invention of the printing press. And we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that we haven't sort of settled it all yet. As I say, the printing press was invented in the 1400s. Journalists didn't really emerge in numbers till the 1700s. It took a while. Yes, the pace of change is quicker these days, but I think we're doing something quite profound. And we should think, I think, what is it useful for journalists to do? And we need to pay attention to society's journalistic capacity. Not because we know how we will govern ourselves and how we will live together in a world where anyone can publish, but because we don't. We don't know that. We really don't know these things. we're living through an enormous increase in the practical expression of the right to free speech. And at the same time, the collapse or shrinkage of the institutions, such as the mainstream media, that previously gathered under that flag. Now, it's important to keep in mind in all this change where the crisis is and where it isn't. It's often said that young people don't read news these days, that there's a declining appetite for news and information. There is no evidence at all to back that up, and quite a lot of evidence that suggests the reverse. Young people are accessing more news from more sources than ever before. And despite everything I've said about the business model, the total readership, online and in print, of newspapers is actually higher than it used to be. People still want news, even though only a minority will pay for it. So the crisis is in the business model and dealing with the cacophony around social media and thinking through these profound issues, not in the appetite for news and information. And in that last fact that people still want news and information, I think there is hope. So in the modern world, the media is often seen as causing division and distress, spreading false alarm, undermining cherished values, emphasizing the negative and so on. Journalists are guilty of all these things. Journalists themselves often talk about their highest aspirations in negative terms. We talk about scrutinizing, questioning, picking apart, exposing. Secrets exist only to be exposed, character only to be divined and found wanting, the murky only to be illuminated. And seen that way, journalism is an essentially corrosive profession, and that's surely one of the reasons why journalists are so distrusted. But the lesson of history is that underlying that apparent corrosive effect of news is a broader and very important social effect. Some might call it a purpose, and that's to do with cohesiveness. People who share news implicitly assume that there are some things that will interest both the teller and the audience. Every time an editor or producer decides on the content of a front page or the lead story in a television bulletin, they're heeding some innate and largely unquestioned sense of the common concerns of the community, even when they get it wrong. The sharing of news is not a guarantee of political stability, but it is, in the words of the historian Mitchell Stevens, a subtle, generally invisible political force. While not necessarily powerful enough on its own to encourage the members of society to march in the same direction, a successful system of news can keep a society oriented in the same direction. So given that journalists were a byproduct of technological innovation, it is possible that the profession won't survive this change in the long term, or at least not as we know it today. But I think that if we want to maintain that social cohesiveness and the ability to have a democracy, then we must preserve and build what I've taken to call in society's journalistic capacity. In a world where anyone can publish, that journalistic capacity doesn't only reside with journalists, it also resides with citizens, which imposes extra obligations on those citizens. We need these things, we need them like never before, but we do need to be able to have a conversation about what's still useful and what we require of the profession. Thanks very much, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Margaret, thank you very much for that excellent analysis. I've just got something here. Yes, it's all right. I've clicked the right button. Sorry. Thank you very much for that excellent analysis. I think everybody will have benefited from it, because we're all probably a little bit guilty of saying, oh dear, the journalist, or oh dear, the media. I'm going to... I
do it myself.
I'm going to actually take the chair's privilege and ask a question, and then I'm very happy for other people, if time permits, to either raise their hand or type something in the Q&A box. But I'm really interested in your opinion on Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, and what we've heard to date is that he's going to promote very much free speech. Now, as much as we all agree with free speech, it doesn't come without any constraints or responsibilities. So I'm really interested, from your vast experience, your reaction to that.
Yes, well, I'm following this closely because I regard Twitter as a fairly important part of my journalistic practice these days. I'm a presence on Twitter, please follow me, and do some of my journalism through it, both feeding and being fed upon, as previously referenced. Twitter, for those of you who don't use it, is a much smaller in terms of audience numbers than either Facebook or even TikTok or some of those other social media platforms. I think the best Australian estimate, again, this is from memory of the University of Canberra research, is that about 13% of Australians are on Twitter. Doesn't necessarily mean they're all active, of course. So it's a minority platform, but it's hugely influential. And it's influential because all the politicians are on it, many influencers in different parts of society, and just about all journalists are on it, although journalists get a caning on Twitter. You have to be a bit robust to stay with it. So it's an agenda setting medium. It's a news feed, really, and particularly suited to journalism for that reason. So what does it mean to Musk to take over? Well, he said that he's a freedom of speech absolutist. Everybody wants to know, does that mean Donald Trump will be back? But I think it's really, we need to look at the context, because there is right across the world now an increased emphasis on regulating social media platforms. Australia has been a bit of a leader on this with our News Media Bargaining Code, but it's happening right across the Western world that governments are struggling with how to regulate. So whatever Elon Musk wants to do, I suspect there will be limits. And of course, the natural limits are those that usually apply to freedom of speech around hate speech, harmful speech. The hard one is misinformation, of course, because one person's misinformation is another's truth. If you believe in the conspiracy theory about 5G towers, then the journalist who's writing about that is a brave truth teller. If you don't believe in it, then it's dangerous misinformation. Who makes that judgment? Journalists aren't elected by anybody to make those judgments. It's a very difficult question, but all of the governments of the world are wrestling with that and wrestling with regulation at the moment. So I don't think Mr. Musk will have all those decisions to himself.
That's reassuring, may I say. Look, I do have a question here in the Q&A box. I have two. One from Anja, to say an excellent presentation, thank you. Do you think there are any best practices in this area, OS, whatever that is, in this area OS, we should be looking to adopt now? And then one more, if I may, if you could, because there'll be only time for these two. Do you have, from Ken Coco, do you have a comment on the more promising innovations by governments, politicians in addressing society's journalistic capacity? And they're the only ones we'll have time for. So Margaret, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll take the first question first, naturally enough. I wouldn't necessarily particularly point to overseas. National borders don't make a huge difference in journalism these days. But I think there is a lot of experimentation around the business model. I don't think advertising is ever again really going to pay for the majority of journalism. We do need other business models. Paying subscriptions is one such, but as previously advised, that tends to make serious media into an elite media. So, you know, that raises the importance of public broadcasting, I think, and there's quite a lot of research to suggest that those countries that have well-resourced public broadcasting, and I'm using broadcasting in inverted commas because, of course, these days it means text and all sorts of different things, do have a bit more cohesion, do have a bit more of a common dialogue than those that don't. And, you know, that the fact that we have the ABC and SBS is one of the things that could make our democratic pathway different, and I think healthier than that in the USA. You can't really underestimate the importance of the ABC in particular in that conversation. In terms of practices, journalistic practices, there is a massive experimentation all the time, and it can be hard sometimes to sort of pick the good ones. As I say, a while ago, everybody was wanting to write opinion, and I think now the traditional journalistic virtues are coming to the fore again, because although it's delivered differently, it proves to be the thing that people will pay for. Who knew people weren't journalists to do journalism? Great realization that that is actually what people will pay for, quality journalism. In terms of promising innovations by governments and politicians, again, Australia's got some things to show here. The News Media Digital Bargaining Code, which has led to Google and Facebook entering serious negotiations with publishers for use of their content. It's a complicated piece of legislation. That won't go into it all here, but it has led for the first time in many decades to quite a healthy flow of revenue to our main media companies, including the ABC. And that is one reason why there's actually quite a lot of jobs for journalists around at the moment, whereas ever since the 90s, it's been really pretty grim for journalism graduates in particular. But now there's a lot of journalist jobs. I was talking to somebody just the other day who's trying to hire and having trouble getting good applicants because there's so much work for journalists around. The ABC has hired a lot of recent graduates, particularly to try and increase its reporting of suburbs. All the commercial media are hiring journalists, and that is the Google and Facebook money coming through now. And that was the innovation of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and Rod Sims, particularly its departing chair. And of course, News Corporation got behind it, which meant the current government also got behind it. And the similar model is now being adopted overseas. The question is, how long will it last? Most of those contracts are 3 to 5 years. What happens when the contracts expire? Will the political will still be there? Is it a sugar hit or long-term sustainability? Too soon to say.
Thank you very much. And thank you for understanding what OS was. I was trying to put it in the form of a system and I'm thinking, oh, I'm not doing too well here. Well, so thank you. Look, that was a fabulous presentation and excellent answering of the questions that were raised. I think we are all better informed about the challenges facing journalism, not only in Australia, but around the world, and the impact that the changes can have on our liberal democratic societies than we were before your presentation. So even though we can't all applaud online, I'm going to do it on behalf of everybody out there in the ASPG. Margaret, thank you. We really appreciate it and are much wiser now than we were before it. So thank you. And now
for your conference. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'd now just like to remind everybody we're going for a 1 hour lunch break. Could you please come back a few minutes before 1 o'clock, and the next part of the conference will go on. That will be fabulous. So enjoy lunch and I'll see you in an hour. Thank you.